So it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful to our organizers who have invited me here. So what I'm going to do today is going to tell you a story about one Polish stateless philosopher who found her way in Cambridge between 1939 and 1954, after which she emigrated to US. This paper that I'm going to present, this is a small part of this is biographical part of the paper I'm writing on a much bigger topic, which is about canon formation, and which takes a closer look on the distinction between minor and marginal figures. So this is going to be a story about nobody's daughter, Rose Rand. So yesterday we could have heard different accounts of at least 3 different scientists who found their way who found themselves in the UK as exiles. And for example, as Professor Berg pointed out, how Karl Mannheim, he says about him, his concepts illuminated his career, and his career illuminated his concepts. So while we could say this about Karl Mannheim, I'm doubtful whether we can say that about Rose Rand, because her philosophical work stayed the same and stayed intact. Her philosophical intention stayed the same during her time in Vienna, where she started her studies, during her time in Cambridge, and during her last 20 years at Princeton. Then again, with Karl Mannheim, we had some key concepts that he focuses on, such as reflexivity and mediation, which then Professor Berg continued to interpret as his way of adaptation, the ways in which Karl Mannheim attempted to adapt to the new climate, adapt to different academic setting and cultural setting. I'm afraid that I'm not able to say that for Dr. Rand. Again, her studies were highly abstract and highly theoretical, mostly focused on deontic logic. That's a branch of logic which looks at the ways in which we can apply logical analysis to non-declarative sentences, that is, the sentences that don't really have a truth value. For example, if we say today is a sunny day, that's a declarative sentence because we are able to verify this sentence by doing some empirical research. It is just looking outside. She was, on the other hand, looking at the ways in which we can adapt logical axiomatic logic to look at demand sentences, for example, the statements that we find in a legal theory, such as demands, such as omissions, such as requests. Also, looking back at yesterday, there was in a talk on CRASSH, our speaker mentioned how Cambridge had opportunities, but also had inevitable limitations, which CRASSH managed to, really nicely cover and continue with his work in some capacity or in different capacity, but nevertheless in a capacity. So in Dr. Rand's example, I fear that that her story is more about inevitable limitations and inevitable or possible or chosen inability to cross those limitations. So I will now get to my talk about Dr. Rand. So Rose Rand was an Austrian philosopher and logician from Polish Jewish descent, who was a regular and active member of the Vienna Circle between 1924 and 1938. So her intellectual work at the University of Vienna, where she obtained her dual doctorate in philosophy and physics, comprised of her participation in Circle's meeting. For those of you who are probably and likely and with right not acquainted with the work of Vienna Circle was a group of philosophers who are today considered to be the people who developed logical positivism or logical empiricism. It's a way of looking at the science, and they were known for their intense exchange of intellectual exchange with figures such as Albert Einstein or Ludwig Wittgenstein or Karl Popper. So they were active in Vienna before World War I, during the World War I, and between the wars, with their activities ceasing with World War II and the Anschluss before that, when most of the members exiled Austria, and continue their work elsewhere, such as in US or in the UK. So her work there comprised in her participation in meetings, where she often acted as a note-taker, her own philosophical work on logic and the philosophy of language, and her work as a researcher in a psychiatric hospital at the University of Vienna. So due to her role as a circus note-taker, which was commonly the position which was commonly occupied by a woman at the university, her notes are the only source of materials. Her notes are the only source of information on what was happening in the circle between 1931 and 1933, a few years before the circus leader Moritz Schlick was murdered on university grounds. So her philosophical work resulted in, among others, a highly successful doctoral thesis from a contemporary perspective, from the authors that work in history of logic and in the logic of demand sentences. Her work successfully anticipated the development of deontic logic, a field of research that is now often viewed as being developed and perfected by, among others, von Wright in 1940s and 1950s. At the time, however, Rand's academic work was diminished by institutional anti-Semitism and the decision to clarify her dissertation as Lichtaria promotion, as a non-Aryan dissertation. Finally, Rand's work at a psychiatric hospital was one of the only ways in which she was able to support her studies and philosophical work. After emigrating to the United Kingdom and becoming a stateless Jewish person in 1938, Rand ended up on the margins of academic society. Despite her excellent academic record and philosophical writings, she was unable to find academic position. Today, Rand's archives are situated at the University of Pittsburgh, and they contain more than 1,600 letters that Rand exchanged with prominent philosophers such as Otto Neurath, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Alfred Tarski, and Karl Popper, colleagues to whom she turned for help on the academic job market, a market that was otherwise favorable to former members of the Vienna Circle. Between 1940 and 1943, she was a visiting scholar at Cambridge, where she attended Wittgenstein's and G. Moore's lectures until spring 1943. From 1943 to 1950, she was employed as an inspector of machine compounds and taught at the Polytechnic Luton in the evenings. In 1950, with Karl Popper's assistance, she received a research grant for research at the University of Oxford. There she had a status of recognized student, a designation reserved for postdoctoral researchers. She attended various seminars, gave informal philosophy classes, and held lectures in German for scientists at the University College and at the Polytechnic in Oxford. After her emigration to the United States in 1954, her career was shot through with more hardships. Without success, she attempted to obtain a permanent academic position, and she mostly relied on translation work and minor grants from National Science Foundation to sustain herself. After her death in 1980, at the age of 79, her personal records were sold to the University of Pittsburgh, where they got partially digitalized in 2012. So in what follows, I will combine uncovered and previously unused archival sources that I found at Rand's archives at the University of Pittsburgh, at Vienna Circle Archives in Haarlem in Netherlands, at the Vienna Circle Archives in Vienna, at the Institute for Exile Studies in Vienna, and some archival materials that I found at the Bodleian Library with a kind permission of Cara to publicize them. So how do we structure archival research? That was one of the questions with which I started this work. Like how do we do archival work? How do we present the information? How do we treat confidential information? How do we treat letters? How do we treat personal and very sensitive information which is often found in letters of very personal nature? One way to do that for me was to organize this material as a form of showing what kind of material conditions was Rand struggling with, which prevented her to achieve some kind of philosophical relevancy or publish a good philosophical paper. So I proceeded by sorting the archival data in three categories. One was the category which talked about her lack of mentorship and peer review. One second category was the category of a workspace, material workspace, having ability to have a workspace or to have access to the library, to have a library card, to have access to journals, to have access to books, and to have ability to copy materials for her personal use. And the third category that I used was a little bit wider, and that's the social network, the social capital. That's basically just the amount of gossip or just the way somebody is perceived in academic circle or in the small social group. So this is how I proceeded, and this decision helped me to better outline the available material and make it available to the wider public for further research. So I'm going to briefly, in what follows, I'm going to tell you something more about those material conditions. I'm going to tell you something short about her lack of mentorship and peer review. After that, I will focus on her time in Cambridge and her relationship with SPSL. And that will be widely then focus on letters exchanged about her personality and her difficulties of adapting to culturally and socially adapting to this environment. And with that, I'm going to close and invite you for discussion. So Rand's time at the University of Vienna started in October 1924 when she enrolled in the first semester of her philosophy degree. Some of her lecturers included Robert Reininger, Hans Hahn, Maurice Schlick, and Rudolf Carnap. After completing 8 semesters, she continued working on several projects, while her primary work was a doctoral thesis on Tadeusz Kotarbiński's philosophy. That was a Polish philosopher, Polish logician. She took a paid position as a tutor at the university and at the philosophical seminar Otakring of the Volksschule Wien in Volksheim, and she also translated Polish articles for Springer. Additionally, she was employed at a psychiatric neurological clinic at the University of Vienna, where she worked with female patients and conducted her own research. Based on her seven years of work at the University Psychiatry, she published a work titled On the Notions Real and Unreal with mentally unstable patients. So she focused on what was then considered schizophrenic patients, and she did some kind of linguistic research with them about what they understood to be real and unreal. This paper was later donated to National Congress Library in US, and it's available online. Until his untimely death in 1936, Schlick was acting as Rand's primary supervisor. After his death, she was able to complete her doctoral dissertation under Reininger, who approved it in 1937. So during this time, we can imagine ourselves being in Vienna at this pre-war time. It was quite a tense situation. So during this time, she was actively seeking support to continue her studies in the United Kingdom and later the United States. So there was this sense of haste due to the difficult circumstances that Austrian citizens, Jewish people in particular, faced at the time. In a letter of recommendation that Schlick wrote in support of Rand's request for Austrian citizenship, he notes that she has distinguished herself through flair and talent, has gained sympathy through her friendly, modest nature, and has always shown the greatest seriousness and absolute reliability. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to unearth additional letters of recommendation written by Schlick during the time he acted as her supervisor. Felix Kaufmann, however, writes that it was Schlick who admitted Rand to Circle's meetings, something that was generally recognized as an achievement given that she had not yet obtained her doctoral degree. In sum, while this mentorship relationship account is lacking, it is clear that Rand did have a doctoral supervisor, first Schlick, then Reininger. However, it remains open for debate in which capacity she received this signed supervision. So in 1938, with the help of the International Federation of University Women, Rand arrived in the United Kingdom. At the time, she was welcomed by fellow philosopher Susan Stebbing, who provided her with temporary lodging as she took up work in St. Albans Mental Hospital for Children. She learned at the time English language and was seeking an academic position. In 1938, while she was applying for a fellowship from Harvard University, the British Federation of University Women provided her with a small grant which was, as they noted, to be spent only on food and not on books. The two secretaries of the Federation considered Rand to be quite unfit for practical life and only interested in her philosophy researches. While the organization showed interest in helping scholars in humanities, the common attitude towards Rand was not one of the encouragement. In the Bodleian Library, one can find rich resources in form of Rand's correspondence with SPSL, mostly with the secretary Esther Thompson, who seemed to have taken care of Rand's case and often acted as a central person for all the actors that showed interest in financially assisting Rand, Karl Popper and Ludwig Wittgenstein. In one such letter, Miss Esther Thompson writes to Jewish Refugee Committee in London. Dr. Rand is quite definitely a problem case. She is really unbalanced and absolutely stubborn in her intention of continuing her philosophical work, which she regards as being of great importance. Professor Wittgenstein last year came to see me several times about her. He's a very kind-hearted man, and although he thought nothing of Dr. Rand as philosopher, he had no opinion on her work, he hated seeing a fellow Austrian so badly off, and he gave me money for her. In the end, I told him not to do so any longer, because I felt it was encouraging Dr. Rand's illusion about her importance as a philosopher. Being continually urged by the Cambridge Committee to find employment, Dr. Rand was offered some humble job, I think in a factory. She consulted everyone about taking it, and everybody who mattered told her she should take the job. She nevertheless refused. The trouble is that she is quite ready to starve rather than give up her work. So in the 15 years that she spent in the United Kingdom, she never had an academic mentor. While she attended the meetings and lectures at the Faculty of Moral Science at Cambridge University between 1940 and 1943 and gave lectures on Wittgenstein in Cambridge, there is no evidence of a more serious mentorship relationship between the two. There was, however, an intensive letter exchange between Rand and Otto Neurath, which took place between 1934 and lasted until his sudden death in 1945. In this correspondence, the most often repeated theme is Rand's difficult financial position. It is clear from the letters that her philosophical work was constantly set aside due to her dire material circumstances. In one such letter she writes, "I wish I had only once in my life the opportunity not to think about the necessities of everyday life and to be so pressed down that only I hope that my energy is able to maintain the balance." From around that time, an account of her stay at the Addenbrooke's Hospital emerged, whose details I wish to share with the audience. So we have two accounts. First account is of the secretary, Esther Thompson, as given to Professor Wittgenstein, and the second one is from the doctor at the hospital. So she writes, "Miss Rand went to Addenbrooke's Hospital to consult Dr. Mitchell, as she had apparently done several times before, about some physical ailment. Dr. Mitchell told her that it would be advisable for her to stay for a few days in the hospital for observation, whereupon Miss Rand declared that she would rather commit suicide than stay in the hospital. Either Dr. Mitchell got really alarmed at this threat, or there was some other reason, but he called in Dr. Noble, the hospital psychiatrist, who ordained that she'd be sent forthwith to Fulbourn. At Fulbourn, she was put in the observation section and remained there. She says one of the doctors told her immediately that it was obvious there was nothing wrong with her mind. Dr. Schlossman told me that he believed that the hospital authorities would not be able to add anything of importance to above information. She is not certifiable, but she is certainly a borderline case. If, however, you wish to have the above information confirmed by the hospital statement, I will try to obtain one for you." So now we have after this follows the official hospital statement. Miss Rand explained her bad physical condition when she went to see Dr. Mitchell by explaining that she was working 10 hours a day in an atmosphere that was severely affecting her on account of the fumes, that on returning to her room she had a certain amount of housework and cooking to do. And, she said, I want to look like a lady, not like a factory worker. Perhaps this trait, which has been annoying at times, may prove in the end her mental salvation. All she said yesterday was reasonable. She made no wild accusations against anyone and no preposterous statements. In short, she had, it seems, and I hope I'm right, and for a lengthy period, faced facts. So, in 1943, the same year, marks the single case so far unearthed, where Neurath noted that he saw Rand's name in Carnap's book on semantics and asked her to comment on series of questions. On the other hand, at the same time, Rand sent Neurath her only copy of her paper on the logic of demand sentences in November 1939 and asked him to comment on it. Later, in the letter from December 1941, 2 years later, we read that her inquiry was unsuccessful and she is now asking Neurath to at least send her back her only copy of this paper. After her immigration to the United States in 1954, she continued to do her philosophical research, seemingly without any form of sparring partner or a mentor who worked in a similar field. One possible explanation for a lack of mentorship could be found in the nicheness of her research interests. To remind you, Rand worked on topics that were still in development and had no widespread institutional attention at the time. Nevertheless, it is evident from the archival data that she exchanged letters with members of Warsaw School, including the Stanislav Kotarbiński, whose work laid at the center of her doctoral research. However, the topics discussed in their correspondence mostly concerned her work on the translations of the works of himself and other members of the Warsaw School. These niches can also help us understand her unsuccessful attempts to get research grants during her time at the University of Princeton. Although her first application was successful, most of her later attempts to get a scholarship, to get a research grant were unsuccessful. In the last year of her life, at the age of 79, she was still writing research grant applications to National Science Foundation and contacting Springer about possibilities of publishing her work. She died the same year from pancreatic cancer. So it is interesting to note that Rand regularly sent letters to the people she knew from her time in Europe and who were able to support her application by putting in a good word for her, people who had themselves obtained prominent positions at the University of Chicago, Carnap, Princeton, Hempel, and Tarski Berkeley. So why wasn't she helped by her social network? Well, a lot of gossip follows. I see now that my time has come almost to the end, right? I still have 10 minutes.
Katarina, we started 5 minutes late.
Okay.
So perhaps if you talk another 5 minutes rather than 10.
Okay. I can do that. So in her letter to her friend Rabbi Sassoon from Sassoon, I beg your forgiveness for this pronunciation, from March 1957, Rand describes that she had moved to the United States in order to obtain a post in philosophy. I believed that my acquaintances will give me a hand to obtain it, but nothing of this kind happened, and I have been left to my own devices. It is true that I'm a member of the Philosophical Association in America, and that the association tries to find for me a job, but they comment that employment for women in philosophy is even more difficult than for men. As we have seen above, Rand never managed to secure a position in her field, even though she was writing research grant application as late as 1979 at the age of 76. So in Rand's case, there's a host of evidence that her former peers had negative attitude towards her. Gustav Hempel and Ina Carnap, for example, regularly talk negatively about Rand in their correspondence. They call her looks most unprepossessing. They said it will face great difficulties, the way she looks, the fact that she's unmarried and that she's a vegetarian. So a variable that may prove even more useful for understanding of Rand's lack of these informal networks is perhaps gender. As already indicated in the above quoted letter to Rabbi Sisson, Rand was aware of her disadvantaged position within philosophy. While her Jewish descent, statelessness, and a poor economic standing definitely impacted the way in which she was perceived by the community, the fact that she was unmarried and a woman trying to obtain a position presented a further challenge to receiving the social support she required. This lack of social support, in turn, has directly impacted Rand's chances of producing valuable philosophical contribution and consequently her chances to reach philosophical relevancy with her work. So, in conclusion, we are historians, we are no judges, we are unable to, I'm unable to speak for or against Rand's case in the United Kingdom. As we heard yesterday, we heard examples of fairly successful stories of adaptation of academics that came here from Germany or Hungary, that were also Jewish, that were also at some point stateless. But yeah, I find it really interesting. I find this case very interesting, and yeah, it's. I'm afraid that this example, her academic career, presents a challenge presents a challenge to the way in which we perceive ourselves as parts of institutions which are aimed at helping academics and helping fellow colleagues who may be different, who may be at times weird or difficult. And yeah, I'm now happy to close this talk and invite you for further questions and any possible discussions you may want.
I think we might take the two papers back.
Oh yeah, sorry.
And then questions at the end. Is that how you prefer to run it? Or?
It's not a good idea to relate to Katarina.
Oh, okay.